Welcome to the International African American Museum. I am Dr. Tonya Matthews, and I have the humbling privilege of being the president and CEO here at this museum. Woo! Welcome to the beginning of our second year. For those who have been paying attention, we just opened up in June of 2023. So we are very, very excited to have you join all the folks who have come. Some of my earlier conversations reminded me that not everyone has been here before, and some folks are just learning. So we definitely want to thank our partners at Yale and Yale Divinity School for that's what we need. We need partners to bring new folks in the door. So just a little bit behind a little bit because we have some veterans who are going to fact check me. As I'm up here, we have our former Chief Operating Officer, Dr. Elijah Hayward, who happens to be a Yale alum. Like, I don't know if that matters. I don't know if that matters. We also have our a board member alumni, Dr. Bernard Powers. And we also have Reverend Isaac Holt in the room, current board member. He's around here somewhere. I think he's eating in that space. So the International African American Museum had the humbling privilege and honor of being able to reclaim the last undeveloped piece of Gadsden's Wharf. Gadsden's Wharf is the former site of one of our nation's most prolific transatlantic slave trading ports. Some of the greatest concentration of Africans who were transported into what is now the United States came in through the very spot in which we are hovering above. And so we honor that in terms of having this power of place. But because we are an African American history museum that gets to tell the story in an African American voice from an African American perspective, we get to help folks understand how we understand. And the first part about that is that we understand, we honor this place, this period of slavery and enslavement. And as we will do tonight, we always tell the truth about that. But the biggest truth that we want to acknowledge is also that this period is neither the beginning nor the end of the African American journey. It is in the middle. And when you're in our museum, whose timeline goes from 300 BCE to 2020 something or other and keeps going, you get an understanding that that's what we're doing. The second thing that we hope that you will feel is to be able to understand the African American journey, is to be able to understand African Americans' unique ability to simultaneously hold the sensations of trauma and joy. Not trauma on Tuesday and joy on Thursday. It is all wound in there together, and that's the way we tell our stories, that we tell our stories in this full context. So when the folks start to sing, perhaps How I Got Over, you might understand just a little bit of that. And so this is us. The majority of the museum will even still be open at the end of the space, so we do encourage you to wander. Some other thanks and acknowledgments I want to do as we're kicking off. Of course, we have many of our members, charter members that are here in the audience. You know who you are. So does my head of membership. In the space, we want to thank you for believing in us, even when we were just dirt on the ground and a glimmer in the eye of former Mayor Joseph P. Riley Jr. But we also have Sister Linda Lader here. She and her husband, Phil, have been longtime supporters of the museum and have even endowed programs such as the program we have tonight. We also have members of the Lilly Endowment who in their vision, they combine spirituality and civic engagement. And so they helped us to launch our entire division on faith-based initiatives here at the International African American Museum. And you'll see a bit of that spark clearly this evening. And I want to acknowledge that we are sitting in the Center for Family History. This is our genealogy center, where when y'all are not sitting right where you're sitting, we have live kiosks that are attached to all of our genealogy and research databases so that our visitors can come into the museum and begin to research and find out about their history in real time. And certainly last, but definitely not least, we have members of the IAAM team in the house. If you all could raise your hands and be recognized. They give me the microphone, but this is the team that makes all of this happen. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge that many of the images that you all saw where you were in Atlantic Worlds at the reception are actually indeed from Yale's collection of rare books and manuscripts. So this conversation in partnership with Yale is older than maybe I am, not really, but in that space. So we're excited to have that. And so now I have the honor of turning the microphone over to our co-host this evening, who's going to welcome our speakers. Dean Gregory Sterling is the Dean of Yale Divinity. Keep still. Your bio is long, sir. Just stay there for just a second. The current Dean of the Yale Divinity School, currently serving as the Reverend Henry L. Slack Dean and Lillian Klaus Professor of New Testament at Yale since 2012. He came to Yale from Notre Dame. I don't know how they let him go after 23 years, but they are regretting it now. And during his decade plus at Yale, he has been a leading theological and moral voice for addressing inequality and injustice in society, and perhaps just a bit on campus as well. Dean Sterling received his bachelor's degree in Christianity and history from Houston Baptist University, an MA in religion from Pepperdine University, an MA in classics from University of California, and still not done yet, he then completed his doctoral studies in biblical studies with a specialization in New Testament at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. A man of many titles, many words from all over the country. Amid this urgent period of national reckoning, he's taken the fight to home. He and the Divinity School have tripled the number of faculty from underrepresented groups and doubled the number of staff and students in their space. So that is how you put the vision to work. He has led efforts to create the Living Village for student housing, a visionary project designed to be the education sector's largest living building residential complex. If any of you have tried to make sure your children or your grandchildren, nieces and nephews have housing these days on a university campus, you understand why initiatives like this are more than necessary. In his teaching and research, Dean Sterling has published more than 110 scholarly papers. He has promised to only present 102 of them this evening. And with that, I turn the microphone over to Dean Sterling.
No, you're not here to hear me, and I know that. You're here to hear the three people to my left, to your right. It's wonderful to be with you. I want to thank everyone for coming to this very challenging and important discussion. Your presence indicates that you have a commitment to addressing one of the great problems that we face in our society, and I commend you for that. We view this problem not just as a political and social issue, but it's a moral issue. And that's why we as a Divinity School are so committed to trying to address the legacies of slavery and the problem of racism that undergird it to begin with, and unfortunately remains in powerful force even to tonight. I won't say anything about the Divinity School in particular. I thank Dr. Thomas Matthews for doing that. But when Peter Salovey, the president of Yale, commissioned a study of Yale's entanglements with slavery in 2020, he set into motion a project that brings us directly to this evening. He appointed David Blight, Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. I think this is the first such center on a major university campus in the United States, to be the head of this particular project. Professor Blight and at his right, one of his right-hand persons is here, so I'm just going to recognize Mike Moran, who's a Divinity School alum as well, sitting back here, who also helped to edit and even write a portion of this book with Professor Blight. But this whole team spent over 3 years working on the book that you see on the table between Professor Blight and Dr. Matthews. He's also the author of more than 12 books. I just will mention 2. Frederick Douglass, and I think most of us know this Pulitzer-winning biography, and probably many of us have read it. And I would also mention just one other book that he wrote, Race and Reunion, which challenges us to think about how we as Americans remember the Civil War. Because how we remember an event can be as important or nearly as important as the event itself. Professor Blight's book was something that I thought I had to read. It wasn't optional. And I required everybody on our leadership team at the Divinity School to read it, and had Michael Moran come and spend a couple of hours with us at our retreat. We had the staff of the Divinity School do the Yale and slavery walking tour at their retreat. And some of you who are sitting here are members of the Dean's Advisory Council. You will get this as my Christmas present. This year I send a book to our major donors, and that's going to be your Christmas present this year. I consider it very important. And so it is tonight that you, if you don't know Professor Blight, are about ready to find out why he has won the American Lincoln Prize, the Bancroft Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, among others, for his work. I consider him the embodiment of a Yale professor. But it wouldn't be enough.
Of course.
It wouldn't be enough. He lives behind the Divinity School, too. It wouldn't be enough to simply talk about what's happened in the past, and Professor Blight's keenly aware of that. It needs to transform us in the present and help reshape, or shape, I should say, our future. We are privileged to have with us tonight another Yale professor whose work is not only grounded in a profound grasp of the past, but who is creating a movement to transform the present and shape the future. Bishop William Barber is, in my judgment, the leading moral voice representing a Christian perspective, and I think even broader than that, but I'll say a Christian perspective, in the United States today. He is the author of 5 books, including The Third Reconstruction, and if you haven't read that, I urge you to read that. That will help you understand this whole movement. And you can see his newest book is between Dr. Matthews and Bishop Barber on the table sitting right there, which is White Poverty, How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. But he's better known for his leadership role in a number of movements. He was the president of North Carolina's NAACP for over a decade. He's the founder of Moral Mondays and the architect who relaunched the Poor People's Campaign that all of us know from Martin Luther King Jr. You will soon, if you don't already, know how powerful he is as a speaker, understand why he has won the Franklin D. Roosevelt Award and a MacArthur Award, which is the envy of every academic in the United States. If you don't know what that is, ask me afterwards, I'll tell you. Many people have worked very hard to make tonight a reality, and I want to recognize just a few. I want to certainly thank Dr. Matthews for partnering with us. And it would be completely wrong if I did not also recognize the person who got the loudest shout-outs, Elisha Hayward.
That's right.
Who is one of our alums, worked here, and now is closer to us, for which I'm grateful. But he was instrumental in making this evening possible. I also want to thank the Yale Club of Charleston that has played a role, and I want to thank Barbara Sabia and her team who have worked tirelessly for a number of months in all of the many details. And if you're here on Barbara's team, Rod, all of you, would you raise your hands? Jake, I don't know. We want to thank them. It is important that a leading research university located in the north is partnering with a major museum in the south for this event. The issues that we face and will address tonight are not sectional, they are not regional, they are national. They affect every American. We will never overcome the horrific legacy of what took place on this spot where we are now sitting or standing if we suppress the history that lies here and elsewhere. We have to be honest about our past if we're to confront it and change our future. And so tonight, I invite you to learn about the past of Yale, New Haven, and New England, and I urge you in the strongest possible way to renew your commitment to help changing our future. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Greg. Tonya for hosting us. Barber, planning. My man Elijah. We go back many places, many times, including here in Charleston. Mike Moran, you were called my right-hand man. I'm not sure it was ever quite that way. Mike was my collaborator on this project from day one. He's one of the great leaders inside the Beinecke Library, and without the magnificent Yale libraries, this book wouldn't exist. Augustine said, if you want to plant a tower that will pierce the clouds, lay first the foundation in humility. Augustinian humility is famous. We sometimes just invoke it without always thinking it through. This was a project that required a lot of humility because it was a process of judging what we would find. Every day you have a judgment to make in research, and then when you're writing, you especially have judgments to make. And my team that I had on this project, and I had a real team on this project, I won't name them all today, but the most important other person was named Mike. We knew our task was to find the truth about Yale's history, about the history of New Haven, about the history of Connecticut and New England, about Yale's place in the world, about the place of slavery in all of this. And we were going to tell that truth, whatever we found. And it needs to be said that the leadership of Yale, Peter Salovey, who commissioned this, and on a day about exactly 4 years ago, called me and asked me if I would manage, research, and write this, he said, report on Yale and slavery. And some of you have heard me say this before. I had about a minute on the phone to wish that phone call wasn't happening. I mean, I knew instinctively what a huge project this would be. I didn't even know quite where I would start. But I had to say yes, of course. But when he asked me to do it, he said, we want to know how Yale was built. We want to know all these entanglements. And you're going to be free to go where it takes you. He initially used the term report, and I almost immediately, it might have been the second call, said, Peter, I don't want to write a report. That's what most universities do, and reports are fine. I said, let's write a narrative history. Let's write a real history that people might read, real people might read, not just people around Yale. Nothing wrong with the people around Yale, but there are a lot of real people who read books. I want to say, too, that Joe Riley, as perhaps all of you here in Charleston know, was the force of political genius and the force of nature that brought this place about. As long as I live, I've had many, many associations with Joe, But as long as I live, I'll never remember having breakfast on a Sunday morning in April 2015 at the Francis Marion Hotel Little Cafe, and Joe brought over his blueprints and his maps and his plans, and he said, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about. He was enlisting me in the project, and if you ever worked with Joe, you knew when you were getting enlisted. And we didn't get through everything he put on the table because everybody who walked into the cafe knew Joe, of course, and Joe had to do a little politicking. But that's how this project began, with lots of blueprints, lots of plans, lots of ideas, and Gadsden Place. I've had the incredible thrill today to be speaking in two sacred places, certainly sacred for me. I did an event in Washington, D.C. at about noon today at Cedar Hill, Frederick Douglass's home in Washington, on a panel. That's a very sacred site to me, his home. I've done not only events there, I've done research in that house, sometimes with white gloves on, and now here. This is, in some ways, the Ellis Island of Black America, right here. This space, this place. And the fact that this magnificent museum is now on this site is incredibly special. I can't say what an honor it is, Reverend Barber, to be on a panel with you. Words don't suffice. I've been one of your distant fans ever since the first time I saw you speak on television. I just want to say a few things about this problem of historical memory, which is kind of what this place is all about, and any museum like it, and then a few words about the Yale and Slavery Project, and we welcome a discussion of it. And you're welcome to buy the book and read it. Memory is a tricky thing, isn't it? Oh, is it ever? But it's the thing possibly that makes us human more than anything else. We can't function without it. It's why the memory diseases are so terrifying. And some of us are of an age where we're a little worried. Oh, come on, nod. It's all right. It's all right. We understand memory when it's individual memory. I forgot this, I forgot that. What was her name again? Where are my keys? All that stuff. God, I know that book has a brown cover, but God, I can't remember the title. Every day, we face this. Memory as an individual we know is biological. It's happening up here in the hippocampus, right in the middle of the neuroscientists have taught us all this now, and they get the biggest grants of all. It's in the hippocampus, and it's in the frontal cortex, too. They're telling us since the 1990s. And this is one of the most amazing things in human creation, this human memory. Because we're the only species, so far as we know, that can actually know its own history, can collect it, display it, interpret it, and write it. That's why it's so troubling. That's why it's so difficult. That's why it's such a problem. And we can't stop doing it. But this memory thing becomes such a fascinating problem when we start thinking of it in the collective, in the social version. How do you know a group memory when you see one? How do you know a memory community when you see one? What is a memory community? This is a memory community. The fact that you're here tonight, this is a new memory. We're laying it down. We're creating associations and synapses for this memory of this event in this place. Social, collective memory is an extraordinary thing. It's also biological in certain kinds of ways, but it's mostly not biological. Our collective memory develops in stories, in narratives, in the tales we tell each other. We come by our social memory, our collective memory, our versions of the past, by family, By churches? By education? By teachers? By Uncle Harry and Aunt Jane? By your grandmother's tales? Don't tell me what happened at D-Day. My grandfather was there. Yeah, well, how much did your grandfather actually see? And pretty soon you're trying to tell that person why we might have historians to help him out. But he didn't want to hear that. He wants to tell you about his grandfather's memory. Memory kind of dictates to us because we get it from generally sacred places like family and church and school. Let's hope schools are still sacred. History, on the other hand, history tends to be what historians do. And nothing wrong with that. Bernie Powers and I have done many, many events here in Charleston. Bernie's one of your great Charleston historians. What we do tends to be the result of our training. It tends to be a kind of reasoned research, and then a writing up of that research, hopefully into a narrative that people can read. History tends to be skeptical and critical of human motive. That's our job. We're not supposed to trust our sources. We're supposed to interrogate them. History, though, can belong to everybody. Everybody has one. Everybody can do it. You don't have to have a PhD to write history. In fact, some great histories are written by people who don't have PhDs. But memory tends to be a sacred set of potentially absolute meanings, absolute stories, or a sense of heritage, a sense of identity of a people, even a country. Memory is passed down through generations. History gets revised, and revised, and revised, and revised. Remember back, I shouldn't name presidential administrations, but it was during the first Bush administration in this century. It became an epithet when somebody put forth a version of the past and the other side didn't like it. They would say, that's revisionist history. To historians, we just roll our eyes. Revisionist history, meaning that, they're making it up now. All history is revisionist. Somebody revised somebody else. And we're still revising what got revised. And yes, we sometimes say, this is right and that's wrong, but we're still revising. My dear departed friend Jim Horton used to say, would you like your doctors to not be revisionist? Haven't learned anything since the 12th century or the 18th? No, we're hoping they're out reading. Is your doctor out reading every day? No, he doesn't have time to talk to you. But we don't want our doctors to not be revisionists, so why would we want our historians not to revise? We do revise all the time. Now, memory, though, as opposed to history, has much more power. Much more power. Because of where it comes from. It comes from inside of us. It comes from that heritage. It comes from grandma's stories. It comes from growing up going to that museum. It comes from growing up listening to Uncle Harry. And then you grow up and you mature and you learn a little history and you have a great teacher somewhere, but it's still becoming a form of memory, of collective understanding, of a story. And who doesn't want to live in a story that at the end of the day doesn't make them feel good? We like our history and our memory and our stories to be pleasing. Tell me one of the good stories once again, make me feel good again. That's not our job. Our job is sometimes to make you hurt, to make you feel, to make you see, to make you understand that history is not an escalator up or an escalator down. It is not, indeed not, always a story of progress. Although Americans have a very hard time getting over that doctrine, don't we? Americans want their history to be a story of progress. I mean, not always for bad reasons. Who wants their fifth grader to come home and say, you know, Mom, I'm learning that history is just everything going to hell in a basket. It's just the world's always getting worse. And people just keep getting worse and worse and worse. No. But the story might be punctuated by some people who made things worse. Systems, institutions, forces that made things worse. Okay. The memory problem is fascinating, whether it's neuroscience or whether it's social and collective memory, but I'll leave that in the air for the moment. Let me just say a few words about how we designed this project, it became this book, and how it came out of a research group project at Yale. We had essentially three major aims, or three major themes in doing this book. And most of the research did come from the magnificent Yale archives and libraries. Much of the story has been hiding in plain sight for 200 years or more. We first wanted to know the history of Yale, that college that became a university, its people, its rectors, its professors, its donors, its presidents, and then some, its alums, its famous alums. We wanted to know the history of that place, that institution through time, the kinds of education it did and changed over time, its mores, changing mores over time, the worlds of knowledge it was creating in relation to this system of human slavery. Then we wanted to tackle this story within Connecticut, within New England, and within the American nation. Yale was very early in its history, before we were a nation, becoming a national college and then a national university. It had international ties from almost the very beginning, especially to the West Indies. A very deep tie to the sugar islands of the West Indies and the slave systems of the West Indies. Approximately 50% of all trade out of New Haven Harbor by the middle of the 18th century was in ships going to Jamaica and Barbados, to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. And the third thing we wanted to dive deep into was New Haven itself, our city, the town, and particularly the black community that was forged in New Haven from the earliest days of a Yale College in the early 18th century, into the 19th century when the black community of New Haven grew, and eventually many of them worked at Yale in all kinds of capacities, especially in its janitorial or maintenance teams. And then eventually some of those people, those families, sent their sons to Yale. And one follow-up we've done, and there are many, many follow-ups, perhaps that's one thing we can talk about as a group. One of the many follow-ups from this book project has been a research project continuing at the Beinecke, Mike is deeply involved with, as are others, tracing the stories of every black graduate of Yale from 1840 to 1940. And I forget what the number's up to now, Mike. Is it 200 or more? 224. See? You can't do a book without people like him. It's amazing. And many of these people haven't even been known before. There've always been a few storied people we knew about, Edward Boucher's and so forth. But there are a lot of fascinating people, mostly from the South, but not entirely, who ended up at Yale as students. In the professional, undergraduates and in the professional schools. I know, 2 minutes, I got it. I'll just conclude with this. I've been asked 100 or 200 times, what were the biggest surprises in this project? What was most revealing? What did I learn? I learned all sorts of things. But perhaps the thing I learned most was I learned something about how I make judgments about the past. When you're writing about your own institution, your own place, you're writing for your own institution at the same time, you're writing as a critical, skeptical historian to try to tell the truth, you learn something about how to make judgments. We also learned a great deal about how ubiquitous it was for 18th century congregational clergy to own slaves. We learned a tremendous amount about the sheer range of people who passed through Yale as students and faculty in the 19th century, all around this question of slavery and abolition. And in the end, we learned a great deal about how Yale decided over time to represent itself, how it chose to tell its own story over and over and over, almost entirely without this question of slavery ever in it. And now it is in it. Okay, I'll end with that. Thank you.
I really wanted to just yield the time to David and continue to listen to him, particularly on this issue of memory. Protocol, as we say in the South, having already been established. I won't go through the thank yous, but I do want to also thank the dean and the school for the opportunity to begin and build a new center for public theology and public policy at Yale, because you see so much of the intersection of public policy and public theology in the reading of this book that David has, this project that he and his team has done. As I was looking at and went back and read many parts of the book over the last couple of days, in the Frederick Douglass book, David said that Frederick Douglass once said, in defining patriotism, that the best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully, he turned this up some, rebukes her for her sins, and her worst enemy is the one under specious garb of patriotism seeks to excuse or defend them. David W. Blight, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. In response to what this book and this project has taught us, I wrote about that we must know and understand the systems of slavery and racism and the 5 evils that birthed and made it and entrenched it as a quasi-sociological religious reality that cannot be easily exorcised from the function of American society, which continues to poison far too much of our real attempts to provide justice for all, even today. There are 5 evils that you have to face when you walk through this project. The first of those evils that continues to hinder us today is the engaging of a heretical, hierarchical, sick, separatist sociology. One of the opening pieces in this project comes from 1638, September 1638, when the Treaty of Hartford is forced upon the native indigenous people, the Pequot's people, designed to both humiliate and liquidate them as a people. Their very name is outlawed because of this notion that you must have a kind of sick sociology that says people can be around each other, but somebody's got to be here and somebody has to be there. And they pointed out in this project that the first Africans in the Connecticut colony were traded from from the indigenous people, that they felt as though they could trade the indigenous people in order to, that were taken prisoner in war for an African slave. This notion that somebody has to be up here and somebody else has to be down here. Now, let's be honest, that concept is still with us even today. This idea of our America. Well, what do you mean yours? Right. Or the story that's brought up in the project about the 32-year-old black man who was convicted of rape and hanged on the New Haven Green, and 10,000 people showed up for the hanging because this sick idea that some are here and others are down here. And, and actually in that showing up, when they showed up, they said that there's the popular text widely disseminated ideas of black criminality, threats to social order, and the propensity to sexual violence. That sociologically there's something different about people just based on skin color. You have to face that because it's still with us. Why do you think when black men were killed by police, innocent black men, they are described as monsters or animals? That comes out of this history. There's a legacy to it. And you have to know it, that it's in society then, and it's still with us now in order to face it. The second one is they were vehement about evil economics. This project shows how vehement people were about evil economics. What I mean by evil economics is that the end justifies the means. If the end is to make money, it doesn't matter how you do it. So if you can do it through slavery, it doesn't matter. However you're going to do it, if you're going to make money, all that matters is you make the money. If it's kidnapping native refugees and then turning them into bargaining chores for black, however you want to do it. If it's using rum and in fact, in one of the statements it says, that what shall be gained by the impost on rum for 2 years next coming shall be applied to the building of a rector house for Yale College. In other words, if it's going to the rector house, it doesn't matter how you get it. If it's going to enhance Yale, it doesn't matter how you get it. And that is still with us today because right now we have a country where 55 million people make less than a living wage, don't have paid leave, don't have health care, the very people that saved us during COVID. But while we have that, we also have people wanting $2 trillion tax cuts for the wealthy among us. This notion that if making money is the end, that's all that matters, so that how you make it, you don't put any moral judgment on it. The third evil that this, in fact, you know that Eli Whitney was a graduate of Yale. And as long as it makes money, create a cotton gin that can produce more poundage of cotton. Morris, who developed Morris Code, came out of Yale, but also had his hands all in the slave trade, because it doesn't matter. If all that matters is money, that's an evil. Then the third evil that we can clearly see through this study is some people insisted on bad biology. 1638, the first known Africans in Massachusetts were purchased, as I said, by the proceeds that were by selling these indigenous captives. But they also, at that time, believed that constantly, over and over again, you can see through the historical documents where it's suggested that this color of skin, a biological reality that no one has anything to do with it, the accident of birth itself, is then twisted to create forms of racism and the taking from people. Think about that, just the notion of skin color, just skin color itself. Then the fourth one, I'm rushing through these, is the legitimized political pathology. You find this through this study. the legitimizing of political pathology. One, not in this study, but in another one, said long before the Civil War, a man named John Chapman said that the institution of slavery was like a sleeping serpent in every moment of this nation's life. It lay coiled under the table at the Constitutional Convention in 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That political pathology is every time you sit down and try to move away from slavery, something poisons the conversation. And political pathology is with us today. Political pathology, the constant attempt to poison our politics with division, poison our politics with separateness, poison our politics by saying that poor people, for instance, are on some kind of glorified vacation of laziness. And that's why you have 140 million poor and low wealth people. You poison the conversation. You suggest that poor blacks are taken from poor whites and make poor whites believe that black folk are against them when in fact the poor whites and the poor blacks need to be allies. But this that we see today grows out of this history. 4 of the signatures on the Declaration of Independence were Yale graduates, and all of them were slave owners. All of them were slave owners. John Caldwell Calhoun of South Carolina graduated from Yale, studied law for 1 year. What does he do? He comes back, he becomes an influential congressman, senator, secretary of war, secretary of state, presidential candidate, vice president, as well as a protector of minority rights. Minority rights is one of those poisons that continue a kind of political pathology. Poison. And what do we have with us today? We still have a form of minority rights. What do you think the Electoral College is? Today, we still haven't gotten rid of that. You can run for president and get 20 million more votes than the other person and lose. But then the one that grabbed me, Dean, is all through this study, you can see how systematically persons employed a heretical ontology. And this is important, David, that you pointed this out. You all pointed this out. You told the story of Reverend James Noyes, who would become one of Yale's founding trustees. And Reverend Noyes viewed enslaved Native Americans or enslaved Africans as sellable property, commodities that were at his disposal because he was a Christian. Because he was a Christian. That he had a theological certainty that because he was a Christian, he had a right to ride his horse into New Haven and displaying a slave behind him. And that was a sign of Christian blessing. Willie James Jennings writes, as a part of this study, the Christian imagination of the English colonists in New England produced a breathtaking hubris, demanding that the natives, black, red, or everyone not white, must be brought from chaos to faith. The land, the wetlands, the field, the forest must be cleared, organized, and brought into productive civilization in this lethal mixture of historical circumstances formed by mercantile empire, religious migration, displacement into New World. The Christian imagination fell into a diseased form, increasingly linked to slavery and conquest, to a concept of property in man that demanded ever more creative justifications. And so it's not surprising that Yale would produce John Edwards, who would become one of the great apologists for slavery. The preeminent theologian of that time was an apologist for slavery. That's heretical ontology at work, a deliberate attempt to suggest all of this is God's way. And if you don't think that's still with us, what do you think religious nationalism is? Religious nationalism that has now twisted Christianity into a diseased form again. It says that if you got to be a Christian, you have to be anti-abortion, anti-gay, pro-tax cuts, pro-gun, and pro-extremism. and if necessary, pro-insurrection and pro-violence. Now, there's no way they can put that on Jesus. That's the problem with Christian nationalism. They got a Jesus problem. They used it, and it's the same problem that the slave perpetrators and owners in the North. That's the other thing about this study. We can no longer, when you read this study, suggest that slavery and racism was just a Southern problem. In fact, Southerners ought to tell the North, apologize to us for talking as though all the only slavery was in the South. No. I see 2 minutes. And what's troubling about it is the level at which the third college, university in this country, that is why Yale has to do what it's doing today. It has to be at the front of repair, reparation, and transformation. And it was the same, and this same theology, heretical ontology, it also suggests that some people can't be educated the same way. So what does Yale, what do they do? When white abolitionists and black people decide to build an HBCU in New Haven, which would have been the first HBCU in the history of this country, 700 people show up in this study, show up in a meeting, and in the name of God, stop it. From Yale and from New Haven. Now, what do we do with all of this? We have to know it then in order to expose it now. We have to know what happened then so that we know what's going on now and we can resist it in the now. Just like Jonathan Edwards Jr. said, just because my daddy believed in slavery and believed that somewhere 100, 200 years later, black and white folk would get together and become divines, but for right now, they had to be his slave. Jonathan Edwards' son became an abolitionist because he didn't ignore this history. He didn't ignore these evils, and he decided that he had to take them on. He had to take on the sick sociology. He had to take on the bad biology. He had to take on the evil economics. He had to take on the political pathology. And he had to take on the heretical ontology in the name of God, because America had to do better than what she had done.
Y'all, we can keep that going. There's not enough applause for our opening comments from both of our esteemed panelists. And I see some of you all didn't realize that we were going to be in class. If you didn't bring your pen and your paper, we are recording this, so we will all get to take our notes at a later time. I saw the phones come out, but I know church when I see it. In terms of that. So thank you both. I think it was just amazing how two approaches and framings that initially appeared so different ultimately came together with a fundamental conversation that history is now and that history needs to be learned from. And so we've got about 20, 25, 30 minutes. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we are going to have an opportunity for the audience to ask a question. Yes, the audience to ask a question of our panelists. So, actually, David, I'm going to start with you because there was something you said that really struck me that was tied into a question that I had wanted to get at, and you said one of the things that you learned and you saw was how Yale chose to represent itself. right? That ability to tell the story. And it began to remind me, I think, of perhaps a microcosm of how, for example, South Carolina, Charleston has represented itself, how our nation has chosen to represent itself. And I appreciate your determination to make this a book, not a report, so that people would read it. So as you're thinking through that, even though we're talking about Yale, and we are talking about Yale in context, what do you think that this process that Yale has gone through, this unearthing of history, this telling this story, what kind of implications does this have for institutions outside of Yale and communities outside of New Haven as we start to interrogate how we've chosen to represent ourselves?
Well, Tonya, thank you. I love that question. It has, of course, a much broader context. I mean, we might even ask, so why are universities doing this at all? And have been now for more than 20 years. There's now nearly 100 colleges and universities involved in an organization called Universities Studying Slavery. Small colleges and lots of larger universities, many in the South, not entirely in the South by any means. This began with Brown University and a couple of others. UVA, Virginia, was early to this process. Yale was late to the process. It turns out, for a variety of reasons that I won't go into now. Turns out there are some advantages in going late, because you can learn a lot from your friends and neighbors and predecessors of how to do this or not to do this. But look, this came about in universities mostly in this century, after some decades of reckonings about race and a lot of other things. This country and most of the Western world had what a lot of us have called a memory boom, a tremendous memory boom in the building of museums and memorials and monuments, commemorations and anniversaries. We have an anniversary, it seems, every day now of something. Well, there is an anniversary every day of something. That was going on big time in the 1980s and 1990s, especially in the wake of the end of the Cold War, which caused a kind of bursting out of new histories and new memories and new nation states, and old ones put to rest and new ones created, at least for a while. And also there was the maturing of this field of the historical study of slavery across the planet, across the globe. This became one of the most booming fields of scholarship of all. In Atlantic studies, in the history of the Atlantic slave trade, the history of slavery in Brazil, the history of slavery in the Caribbean, the history of slavery in the United States, and the histories of abolition. Because abolition has occurred, abolition occurred over a century of time in between 25 and 30 nations and empires from the beginning of the 19th century all the way to the last one to do it, which was Brazil. So there was a maturation of this field, which is also a factor here. But there's no mistake either that Peter Salovey called me in the summer of George Floyd. I mean, it was after, not just George Floyd, but so many other police shootings, the reckoning that was going. Remember how often we were using the word reckoning all of a sudden in 2020? We were reckoning with COVID, but we were reckoning with a racial crisis. And everybody was issuing statements about the new racial reckoning. If you didn't have a statement out about the racial reckoning, you weren't doing anything. Turns out statements are barely a beginning, are they? But Peter decided it's high time we do this by that point in time. Now, there are plenty of other reasons why it came about. I don't think we know yet exactly what this study will mean for Yale itself. I can tell you just a few things that have already happened or are happening. From the small scale, like there's a whole new walking tour of the Yale campus if you come to visit, which thousands of people do, bringing their kids to check out Yale, or just tourists. It's an alternative tour. It has its own app. It has about 12 or 13 stops all over campus. At each stop, you have an audio tape telling you about this story at different places on the campus, different sites, about different people. And some of us are on those tapes. There are kiosks going up. So far, only one at the Yale War Memorial in Woolsey Hall, which is a favorite subject of mine in this book. I could come back to that. A lot is happening at the upper level. Peter Salovey's left the presidency, of course. We have a new president, Maury McInnes. But there are serious commitments by Yale now to creating a whole variety of fellowships, scholarships really, for black students to go to HBCUs from New Haven and the surrounding areas if they so choose to. The scale of that is starting small, but it will grow. A favorite project of mine that is coming out of this, although it's taking a couple of years to get planted, it's an absolute favorite subject of mine, is that Yale is going to pay to send Yale students, as well as other students, to get their teaching credentials, to become secondary teachers, elementary teachers, to become teachers, public school teachers, which is not the typical thing to do, is it, for a Yale student? But it turns out a lot of them would like to. Yale's going to pay for their teaching degree, but they have to commit to come back and teach in New Haven, a school system like so many that has a dire lack of teachers. It has a terrible teacher shortage. They had 90 positions open last year they couldn't fill. The town needs public school teachers. This program could grow. It could grow well beyond New Haven. I hope it does grow. I was a public school teacher myself. There, but for the grace of God, go I. And plenty of other projects have been launched, economic projects in the town. I could go on about that. I don't know that we've changed as an institution just yet, except that there is now very much a general recognition that Yale has this history. And I was stunned the other day when I went to the bookstore to check on my books for my course, and I'm teaching a course about this. And the people in the bookstore said, you won't believe this, but your book is the second best-selling book we've had all summer in this bookstore. Now, I don't make any royalties on this. The royalties go internal to Yale for good causes. I don't make a dime on this, but I was amazed. People are buying the hardback?
That's
Whoa.
right.
That's right.
So that's good news.
very good.
So people are reading the darn thing. But I think it's going to take a little time to know, did this have a social impact? Did it have an impact beyond our own boundaries? Because the best thing Yale can ever do is to take what it does, in my view, which is create knowledge and teach outside of its own boundaries.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And I think perhaps even if it is just raising the bar so that the expectation is that all of our public school teachers go to institutions like Yale and come out and teach the fifth graders, it will change the conversation around what we're expecting and how we should be respecting our public school teachers. Nod to my mom. Okay. So a question for you, Reverend Barber, and hopefully you can help me with this. My language is not going to be as gentle, as useful. Because sometimes I am curious, and David brought it up a couple times in the book, of what I will call a willful disconnect around what the right and left hand of doing in a single person. So for example, we get stories around Senator Hillhouse, right, who's on the forefront of creating this legislation around limiting the spread of slavery and enslavement, and even trying to regiment where folks who quote unquote own people can even take their folks or have their folks, and some really stringent, some of the toughest laws and legislation that would have ever impacted the country, that he was pushing that, he was moving that through, while at the same time, his family enslaved people, own folks, not just the first wife, first and second wife, in terms of that road. So on the one hand, pushing around the elimination, or at least the reduction of this. And so I see that even today, where we get into spaces of working to fix societal problems, race, poverty, equity, but we seem to want to do that without depriving ourselves of the privilege that those conditions allow us to have. So how would you advise us to help our nation, or perhaps just our neighbor, to navigate this kind of disconnect in the way we're approaching some of these conversations?
Well, one of them is to resist the lie that for other people to be lifted up, you have to somehow be brought down. That goes to this kind of sick separatist sociological perspective that if somebody gets a living wage, it's going to take something from me. That has always been a stringent argument among races in the country. That's what the Klan used. That's what racist politicians have used. That if we do this, it's going to hurt us. That was the developers of the Southern strategy literally told Richard Nixon, we know how to win, but in order to win, we must engage in positive polarization. It's in a book called Time of Illusion. We must create division among the very people who should be allies, and if we get caught doing it, we'll lie and say we didn't have anything to do with it. They literally said that. So we have to get rid of that. The second piece is, America, we have this complicated history. But one of the things that Dr. King said on occasion was, he said the greatest enemy to the movement for justice was moderates. And that position you just talked about would have been considered a moderate position. I'm going to own slave, I'm going to uphold the system over here, but over here I'm not going to enslave, I'm just going to restrict folks being able to bring slaves from outside of New Haven or something like that. Or I'm going to emancipate the slaves, but only in the states that are in rebellion. So if the states aren't in rebellion, they can keep their slave. These moderate positions, and I say that as a Christian minister, are contrary to Scripture. Scripture actually says something like this, Isaiah chapter 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. Woe unto those who Matthew 23, who tithe cumin and tea leaves, but leave undone the weightier matters of the law, which is righteousness or justice. We have left so much undone, which means why we still have so much to do. And I'm afraid for this moment we're in. I think we have to have a serious third Reconstruction. It's not so much, as I told some young people one time they were talking about pulling down a Confederate statue. I said, I understand that, but we've got to pull down some of these political statutes. These statutes that rob us of our voting rights. Do you realize we go to the Edmunds Pettus Bridge every year and memorialize what they did in 1965, but the laws have come back across the bridge.
Yeah.
So at the very time, we've actually gone to that bridge and not one time said we need to start a movement. We don't need any more commemorations. We need a reconcentration, a recommitment, a consecration. What I want to see with museums like this, and I think Yale can't wait. Yale has to be on the forefront of helping to be a movement. That's why I think the courage of the dean and others to start kind of a first of its kind Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. It took us 400 years, 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow to get to $7.25 an hour, minimum wage. What are we gonna do, wait another 400 years to get to 15? If you start really thinking about how crazy this is. And so here we are in a country where we have all of this remembered, all this economic injustice that kept people from having wealth and whatnot. And yet, as a country, we have a minimum wage today of $7.25 an hour. And we've not raised the minimum wage since 2009. Everything else has gone up, including the salaries of the politicians. 350,000 people died during COVID because of the lack of health care. COVID didn't discriminate. We discriminated in the way we gave services. We've had 1,000, at the very time that we have all of this history, we had 1,000 voter suppression cases, bills since 2013, when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. We had 1,000 of them. 50 million people are now negatively impacted by voter suppression law, not black people. So what is happening now is there is actually a spillover to where it's not just being isolated. So for instance, 60% of black people are poor and low wealth, but that's 26 million people. But 30% of white people are poor and low wealth, that's 66 million people. So here we are today, 50-some years post the Poor People's Campaign, and we've got 140 million poor and low wealth people. My point is, this history, we've got to learn from it and act on it, right? It must be a way that we use this history, this book, to cut through the lies, to cut through the distortion, to motivate a new book. That's why those kids are buying that book, because these kids out here are hungry. They're tired of hurry up and wait. We've waited too long, and they're hungry for transformation. They want to see a reckoning, and the most dangerous thing you can do is keep this museum alive in this sense. David said, I didn't say it, but I believe it, that memory is a prelude to reckoning. And that's why I love things like this, because every time this kind of truth comes out, it lets me know the reckoning is coming. And by reckoning, I don't mean violent reckoning, I mean nonviolent. I mean there's going to come a point that the weight of the injustices and the division is too heavy for the society to exist, and we're going to have to do what God said to Joseph: choose this day. Not another 10 years, not another 5 years, not another 20 years. America, you got to choose this day. Are you going to restore, repair, and revive from all of this pain that was self-created through these systems that started out maybe to hurt black and brown and Native people, but actually now the results of them, the residual results of them, hurt us all.
Right.
Hurt us all. And that's why this book is so important. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book about how to white poverty, and looked at poverty through the lens of my white brothers and sisters to unpack the mythologies that have arisen around even how we look at poverty.
Now, Reverend Barber, you actually said two things that actually brought me full circle for my last question before we let the audience ask questions. Because you said, you understand the worrying about political statues, but we should be worrying about political statutes. And then you took that around to memory as the prelude to reckoning. And I heard a lot of mm-hms and shaking heads, Professor Blight, when you talked about memory communities and how memory is sacred, right? And we think about it in a very interesting way. One of the things that fascinates me about the museum is as we watch diverse groups go through the museum. Right? And I see African American, this is a generalization, communities come through and they are surprised and rejuvenated to see their story as they remember it. I see white communities come through and they are surprised and rejuvenated that the stories they're hearing are inspirational because the stories don't necessarily match the stories of the community that they heard.
Right.
And so my question to both of you, before we go through from a historian perspective, from a theologian perspective, as we come to this space of perhaps clash, perhaps connection of differing memory communities, if we honor the memories of every community as sacred and as creating identity, there are differences in those. So when those communities come together, from a historian perspective, or how you would think about how you write the book, or how you give the sermon or the advice, what are your thoughts about as we enter this space of a clash? And I'm gonna say clash, but I don't mean it as a bad thing. The clash of these memory communities finally coming together simply because part of the reckoning is understanding that their memories are different. And then you get to the then what. So David, I'll start with you, and I promised them they could ask a question. So we're gonna do the short version.
Well, I love your word clash. Clashes do mean conflict.
Right.
You can have multiple groups. You can have 6 different kinds of groups in here in this beautiful and wonderful space. And it would set a tone of both thinking and behavior, and probably everyone would behave. But out in society that the Reverend's talking about, People are competing for money. They're competing for jobs. They're competing for, decent wage. They're competing, well, they're not even competing for health care because some can't get it. They're competing to get into schools. We have an incredibly unequal education system in this country. I went to public schools and public universities. I have nothing against private universities, and I've now worked for 3 of them. And I worked for a very famous one. Although actually Yale had a short period of time when it was actually a public university, when the state legislature supported it around 1800. But out in society is where all the structural clashes have to occur. The structural, economic, political clashes. And our politics is, of course, pitting everybody against everybody, because that's what wedge politics is about. It's finding what divides these people and getting my people to the polls more than they do. That is politics, folks. It just is. Now, what we have is this extremely difficult task of sustaining a real democracy, of pluralism. We are a democracy of pluralism, God knows. It's more pluralistic than ever, and every day more. But it's very hard. Democracy, you've heard that word so much the last 8 years that you're probably tired of hearing about it. In fact, as a person who has to go out and speak all the time, I keep trying to look for different new words for democracy now, because I can't use that anymore. I mean, think about that. But democracy means you agree to give up something such that your fellow citizen can have what you have. Or they have to agree to give up something, to join you. I just came from a panel today where part of the conversation it was about Frederick Douglass, but it went around to this election and how people vote, and the question was about white suburban women, that crucial voting bloc, and why do they vote this way, why do they vote that way? We can ask that about anybody. Why is our political behavior always about ourselves? Well, it's because we're selfish creatures. We are. I mean, you said earlier we were walking by all these amazing visual images, and Tonya said, people do like to talk about themselves. God, is that true? Every kid in school learns that in a hurry. Every teacher does. But voting and political behavior and participation is doing that which the society might benefit from. How can we get people to vote that way? And not always about them. What have you done for me lately? What have you done for me lately? I don't care about your me. What about the whole? Well, I do care about your me. But what about the whole? It's called a social gospel, as the Reverend knows. Outside of ourselves is where a democracy will function, not inside of ourselves.
Thank you, David. And I think David then just previewed.
Yeah, he's a preacher, just jackleg.
Took the answer.
But some of the greatest.
I try to appear with him, so it rubs
some of the
off.
greatest preachers are historians, because what Dean, over 2/3 of the Bible is a response to a particular historical period of about 70 years. Yeah. What happened in captivity, and post-captivity. Let me read some quick thoughts, and each one of them could be fleshed out over a long period of time, but I'm going to do it real quickly. As you said, thinking about this. I want to close with one little scripture, but I think that we have to remember some things. I'm looking at the pictures around. I go into museums, but I think about what picture was it that moved Rosa Parks. It was not the cute picture. What started the civil rights movement? It was when Ebony Magazine and others dared to put, and Mamie Till, or Mamie, his mama, said, "You will look at my son. You will share this memory. I will not bear this memory alone. I will force you." And she let them put his picture as it was. And Rosa Parks, one book I read said that when she saw that and watched the killers get off, when she saw that boy, she made a commitment then. I'm going to Highlander. I'm going to get fully trained, Jewish women, white women, Senator Highlander. And if you think that the sit down just happened, just one day she just got tired, that picture from that point forward, she was already engaged in it because there had been efforts before. But when that happened in Emmett August 28, it did something to her. And I think that we cannot leave the ugly out of our memory, because oftentimes it's the only thing that produces metanoia, repentance, which is the only thing that's going to produce reconstruction. You have to repent of what is. You got to start that something's not right about this. The other thing is, I think museums in some ways have to act to produce movements. There's a writer at Duke that says used to be when in the conquering world, when they conquered country, the first thing they went after the museums, they went after the libraries, and they made the language secondary, and then they went after the money. But they went after that library first because it had so much power to cause resistance, right? So what I would love to see in some museums is that we show a time period, say like when Yale and some of the folk at Yale participated in blocking the vote of black people and Native people, and then draw a line from there where that same rationale has been done through it. Not to blame Yale for all of it, but to show how that rationale is always around, right? And that part of what we have to do is expose it and challenge it and not act as though it's something new, right? That there has always been the fear of a swing vote. I think it's one of the reasons, and then maybe that would help us think deeper about a swing vote. Like you said, you go somewhere, they talk about the women vote and the young vote. The biggest swing vote in the country now is poor and low-wealth people. Poor people make up 30% of the electorate and 40% in battleground states. In every state where the margin of victory was 3% or less in the last election, poor and low-wage folk make up 42% of the electorate. Like in Michigan, the last time the margin of victory was 10,000 votes, 1.2 million poor and low-wealth people didn't vote. And you know the number one reason they didn't vote? Nobody talked to them. It's not voter suppression, nobody talked to them. The suppression was not talking to them. Right? And it's almost as though we have forgotten that voting is hard and you have to campaign and you have to work for people. So what if the museums kind of also had some timelines that connect the movement? And then the last thing is we've got the voucher system we're seeing today. That the rationale for a voucher system is the same intellectual rationale for blocking an HBCU. It's that we don't want certain people to have the same opportunity, right? And it's the same system that the rationale that was used to try to continue segregation by creating vouchers in the 1960s. It's not new. So what's important is for sometimes to have a place where you can not only see what was, but understand what people are trying to do today by what has already been done and didn't work then, and it's not going to work now.
Let's hope so.
At least if it doesn't work, if it does work, it's just going to take us further and further backwards. So in this moment, when we see beautiful museum like this, and yet at the same time the attacks on DEI, we see, I walk past voting rights, and yet we see voting rights going backward. I walk past when the hospital workers here were fighting for wages. And yet we're in a fight right now to try to get 55 million people a living wage, because in the last 2 years ago, 8 Democrats and 49 Republicans in the Senate said no to 55 million Americans. 8 Democrats and 49 said no to 55 million Americans. But when I see that picture there, in my mind, I connected it to the struggle and reminded myself that they fought then, we have to fight now. They won then, we can win now. And that's why the scripture is this. Moses, in the last portion of Deuteronomy, says something, David, that's kind of what you've done when you gathered the team. Moses said, and Dean, correct me if I'm wrong, he's a New Testament scholar, but he knows those. Moses says, and I'm gonna try to preach on this tomorrow. He says, Yeah, that's why I'm testing it tonight.
I think you already are. Yeah.
But Moses says, God tells Moses, every 7 years, gather everybody. Even gather the non-Hebrews. Gather anybody that happens to be coming through your country. To service everybody. And rehearse and remember the history. For the sake of Egypt and Israel. Tell the story so that it can help Egypt stop being the oppressor at that time. And it can help Israel not become lazy or become like the oppressor that they did not like.
Wow.
Every 7 years. Every 7 years. Not once every 6 years. Every 7 years. Gather everybody. So that you will not have a generation that acts as though they do not know a thing.
Well.
That's what the text actually says when you translate it. So that you will not have a generation that will not. So when people say today, oh God, things are so bad today, sometimes I want to say, will you shut up? Have you read David Blight's book? Don't you realize that things have been worse than this before? And guess what? There's another history. People stood against it. People didn't accept it. People overcame it. People fought it. And if they could do it then, we ought to do it now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So clearly, that was a positive test. That will definitely work tomorrow. So we will take time for, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do 2 questions, but we're going to do the questions at the same time. And then we're going to let the gentleman answer them, right? So that we can get 2 questions in there. And by question, I mean it has a question mark at the end of the sentence and a significant lack of prelude in that. But please do introduce yourself to us as you are asking the question. We'll take 2 questions, and then we will let the gentleman pick and choose their answers for that. Thank you. Please.
I'd like to ask a question related to the immense white and black wealth gap in the country. And I think your book gets to it, I think your remarks get to it. And my concern is about reparations.
If you can hold the microphone to you.
My concern is about reparations, my fault. About reparations, which is about 80% of the country that don't want it and about 20% that do. Okay, I get that. But just recently at Duke, Dr. William Darity wrote a book, From Here to Eternity, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. Yeah. Number 2, what do you say about reparations? Does it have a role? And does Yale have a role with the 100 universities that have done DEI work throughout their campuses and so forth? How about organizing them to focus on the 2 committees in Congress? Senator Cory Booker introduced a reparations bill back in 2018, and so did Jackson Lee, Sheila Jackson Lee, who unfortunately passed away, but that's in the House. So at one level, it seems to me that Yale could focus at in the legislative level to get at a role for reparations as one step towards meeting the wealth gap.
Thank you. So our first question, I want to applaud the question, put the big old elephant in the room that we all been thinking about. So the first question to our guests will be on their thoughts on reparations and what that may look like for us. We'll go ahead and do the second question, and then we'll let folks answer. Fantastic.
Thank you to all the panelists. You guys did an amazing job. My name is Matthew Stevenson, and I serve in the curatorial department with a team of 3, and we pretty much work over all exhibitions and media related to the museum. So my question to you all is, with this museum being on the sacred site, one in which so many enslaved Africans came through, one of the enslaved Africans is actually Michelle Obama's great-great-great-grandfather came through this site. We have the largest slave revolt that never happened. Demar Vesey was eventually hanged in downtown Charleston. We have the Mother Emanuel massacre down the street. Finally, we have the Briggs v. Elliott court case, which laid the groundwork for Brown v. Board. which was downtown Charleston as well. With Charleston being the genesis for the African American experience and the cornerstone as well, what does the African American experience in Charleston mean to you all?
Okay, so then that second question from our very own Matthew Stevenson is, what does Charleston as an epicenter of some of these conversations mean to both of you? And perhaps you may have thoughts for what we mean to the nation. And so we are in between us and the book signing, which I know we all want to get to. So I'm going to start with you, David, and pick and choose how you would like to parcel out your answers.
I'll take the reparation question
Okay.
first. It's usually the first or second question at most events, isn't it? I know Sandy Darity's book very well. I know Professor Darity. His project, though, tends to end up in trillions and trillions of dollars from the federal government. Now, we can all make a moral case that that's not a bad idea, but it's also politically not going to happen. So repair of the past becomes a task of all kinds of other solutions, policy solutions, sometimes involving a lot of money, educational solutions, sometimes involving a great deal of money, commemorative solutions, such as this great museum, which takes a great deal of money, et cetera. You know that. So repair is a very, very tricky process. I have the luxury of being a historian and saying, oh, learn the history first, as the Reverend just said. Just learn your history first, then you'll decide how to do repair. Yeah, sure. Sure you will. You might. But repair, serious repair of the past takes collective action, more than committees. I mean, would that Yale University had some great influence over the United States Congress, which I don't think it does, to speak of. It takes it takes coalitions to come together and say, you know, this city, as Evanston, Illinois did, should do something about redlining. And anyone who it can be proven and demonstrated that they experienced redlining back from the 1920s on into the 1970s, they will get X amount of dollars or tax credits or a real estate loan because of this story of redlining. And the people can be named, they are living today, they are not some abstraction. Coalitions of cities could do that. Coalitions of states could do that. Part of the problem with reparation, though, it's the last thing I'll say. It's a very complicated question, a fascinating question. And by the way, when we launched this Yale and Slavery Project, one of the things we did, is about 6 or 7 webinars. This was all during COVID. Everything had to be a webinar. We did webinars on all kinds of topics. One was on reparation. And I did it as a panel about comparative reparation. This has happened all over the world. There's been a reparation regime in India, a reparation regime in Argentina, reparation regime in South Africa. There's a huge German reparation regime since World War II. Many countries have had, and they're very different systems, very different styles of repair. And I had a couple scholars on the panel. I had Sheila Jackson Lee on the panel. And believe it or not, Tom Steyer. Mm-hmm. Remember Tom Steyer?
Yep.
Ran for president, very rich guy, Yale graduate. He didn't give my center any money after that. Anyway.
Gotta give it to the Divinity School.
That's true. He probably had, Greg had him already wrapped up. Anyway, but seriously, we did a serious panel. It was on a webinar. We sent it out to the world. We had a lot of audience. But we did it through a comparative look because there's no one way to do it. And Americans have a special set of problems talking about this that other countries have already been through. Why not model some other efforts that have already been done, whether it's Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa or other systems that have, and there've been repair measures and policies that are largely about education, which is slower. But frankly, mobility in this country has always been tied to education. Always has. I'd be nowhere without the public schools I went to. I'd be nothing. I'd still be working plant security in Flint, which is what all my mother ever wanted me to do. Actually, the plants are all gone, so I wouldn't be. Anyway.
Oh, gracious.
But Charleston, I don't know, man. You got as historic a city as, doesn't Charleston even claim it's the most historic American city? I'll just answer it this way. I've had many associations with Charleston. I've done a lot of research in Charleston. But the most moving experience of my professional life was on an April Sunday afternoon, the same Sunday where I had breakfast that morning with Joe Riley. That afternoon, we held a ceremony up in Hampton Park, commemorating the site of the first Memorial Day, established and practiced by African Americans on May 1st of 1865. There's now a wonderful marker there that I dedicated with Joe Riley about 12, 14 years ago. I was on the platform that day with Clementa Pinckney, who delivered an 11-minute homily. I know it's 11 minutes because it was videotaped. I went and watched it over and over and over. He based his homily that day on 1 Samuel. Mm-hmm. Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom.
Yep.
Absalom is making war against his own father. Reverend Pinckney turned that text, that scripture, into a metaphor of civil war. Mm-hmm. And into a further metaphor of how one heals, if possible, from civil war. And then we ended the ceremony. I was holding the same program as Reverend Pinckney as we sang 2 hymns with the Citadel Choir. And 2 months later, I had my TV on one night, and you know what I saw at Emmanuel AME. So this town has a beautiful, powerful, and terrible place in American history, and all of that has to be told.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
You're right, David, all of it. And I think that there are 5 interlocking injustices that are connected, and America has to face them and fix them. And if she doesn't, I really don't want to see what could possibly be. I think what you saw on January the 6th could be a fairy tale compared to if we don't deal with the inequalities that exist. The special rapporteur for poverty at the UN and I were talking one day, and he shared with me that he was not necessarily a person of faith, believed in God, but he knew if there is a God, he knew there's a God-sized problem, a problem that at least people who claim to believe ought to be at the forefront of. He said, because there are 3 lies. The lie that we don't know what to do and how to fix things. It's just straight up. He said the lie that we don't have the resources. Even when we say trillions of dollars, we have the resources if we would reshape the way in which we do. 54 cents of every discretionary dollar now goes into the war economy. It doesn't even go to veterans and people that don't have legs and have been hurt, just the war economy. And he said, but the other lie is that we keep framing things outside of them being a moral issue, or we think moral means just you feel good about it, but you can't do it. When really what moral ought to mean is you can't afford not to do it. That life doesn't mean anything if you don't do it. That you've wasted breathing, wasted existence, that you failed your generation, you failed your moment. That when you say such and such a thing is a moral issue. And so systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, and the denial of health care combined, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism are 5 interlocking injustices that will not be dealt with a black movement or a white movement or a brown movement or an indigenous movement or an Asian movement, but an intersectional, in every way movement of people. that's one of the things that we're trying to say to America with this Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, that these realities and what they cause, and I won't go down the list, we have a book called The Souls of Poor People, and what we do is we disaggregate based on race, based on color, based on geography, based on gender, based on sexuality, how the inequity of poverty is hurting us all. I remember when we wanted to show that there were 40 million more poor white people, low-wage white people, than there are black people, and some white people said to me, you can't do that. And black people said, you can't do that because we got to make sure, because people will then turn away from the issue because we need to just focus on the black side of poverty. And I said, and as long as you do that, you're allowing folk to marginalize the issue. What you have to do is face it all. You got to face it all. You got to make it our problem as a whole nation. And so reparations, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but neither did ending Plessy versus Ferguson. It took 50-some years of movement building. It took case after case. I think we tend to look at things as like having a one election cycle or one person get elected and that's going to fix it all. No, everything that we hold dear today that's progressive, that's liberated us, took effort over a period of time. It took movement building. It took moral unity, not of everybody, but a sustained body of people. So we have a bill called the Third Reconstruction. It's actually before Congress now, asking for people just to admit, do they have the resolve to even think about 20 things that if we don't do them, what it's going to do to this nation. If we leave 55 million people continually with low wages, what you saw on January 6th might just be a fairy tale. If we keep letting people die unnecessarily from the lack of health care, the reaction to that, at some point, that pot is going to boil over. History tells us that. At some point, there's going to be a real reckoning. And so, lastly, what I want to argue is on reparations. We need to talk about it not just as a black issue. First of all, I get hit by this sometimes, but how are you going to jump over the native people? Now, I know, and then when folks say, okay, well, they didn't say that, no, we just heard this history. You cannot jump over the native people, the First Nation, right? And then you have to talk about reparations until if it happened, what would be the benefit to everybody, to the whole country? That what would that do? Just like a living wage. If you pay 55 million people a living wage, it would push $330 billion into the economy, and it would actually strengthen us rather than weaken us. We have to begin to talk about how it's not just about taking, but about how doing right and overcoming past wrongs actually lifts and benefits everybody. And that has to be, those 5 interlocking injustices have to be faced, and I believe have to be faced by this generation, and that we must find our way to a third Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction was after post-slavery, and it was working. It was assassinated, it was killed, it was murdered, it was outlawed. The second Reconstruction, 1954 until say 68 or so, was working, but it was murdered, it was divided, it was killed. We must finish the work. We never finished. That's what I want to say. The history tells us we never finished. We were headed a place and we never finished. And it may be that you are alive today in all of our diversity here to engage and finish a third Reconstruction. Not just one election, but a real Reconstruction. And then on the Charleston thing, June 16th was when it happened. June 16th is also the day that Denmark Vesey changed the revolt to, because too many people, he said, had found out. And so Denmark Vesey had changed the date of the uprising to June 16th. And June 16th is when I don't think we've talked enough about what happened that day. That Pinckney was late because he was arguing for more education dollars. that the people that were in that church that night, many of them were involved in unions. They connected their faith to social justice. That De La Rue was found in Shelby near the site of the street that's named after the state senator from North Carolina that wrote the book that became Birth of a Nation. I don't think we've talked about that. How quickly people were asked to forgive before they had even cried. And then I will tell you this, I've never told this in public before. One of my students went up and pulled that flag down. Her father taught me, C.G. Newsom. That's his daughter, taught at Duke. His daughter, one of my friends and students, she went up on that flagpole and showed how quick that flag could have come down. And then the governor made a black cop hold it, you know. But here's the thing I want to mention to you. I called some folk here in this state and said, now that there's all of this, why not you create an omnibus bill and say that one flag coming down is not enough for 9 lives? It was 9 people? Now, that you cannot say that black life is only worth one flag. That black life has to be worth more than just one flag. So in light of that, we're going to push an omnibus bill, and we're going to say we want the flag down, we want educational money up, we want resistance to labor unions up. Before I could get it out my mouth, the political person in this state said, well, let's hold up on that, and let's do what we can do. If we're going to always just do what we can do and not think deeper than that, in that moment, when the whole world's eyes, couldn't you at least just have the debate in South Carolina that say that the only way you can honor 9 deaths is at least say we're going to fund the corridor of shame.
Oh.
At least that, right? We're going to put some more money there. But there were persons that, even some that look like me, that said, well, let's do what's politically expedient. And for 9 lives, one flag. I beg folk to wrestle with that. What is the meaning of that? I'm not judging anybody, because we got our problems in North Carolina too. But you cannot just walk past that. 9 lives. Only the reparation for 9 lives was just one flag. One old raggedy flag of a lost cause. 9 lives. And did anybody ask the question, is that too small? Is that too small?
Well, Pastor, with that, I'm also going to suggest that perhaps some of us other folk in the room have had our Rosa moments. And so when folks ask why I would move from Washington, D.C. or Detroit, Michigan to come and do a project like this in a place like this, perhaps that is why.
Amen.
Perhaps it took just a little bit longer than folks expected. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for our 2 speakers. Absolutely. Thank you.
You in Detroit?
I was in Detroit.
I grew up in Flint.
That's right, you mentioned that.